With millions dying of thirst and silence pouring from G20 nations, a single sentence from Washington ignites a storm across Africa. One stood against a $400 million contract. The other blocked a bill that could have stripped clean water from the poor. Together, they lit a fire the world couldn't ignore. When the world starts selling survival to the highest bidder, who will be brave enough to break the auction? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The warning hit like a shock wave through the corridors of global power. The Sahel is collapsing. The United Nations had issued its most severe climate alert in decades. The worst drought in 70 years was turning West Africa into a slow-motion graveyard. Crops had vanished. Livestock lay shriveled in the sun. Winds swept across once green fields, now cracked and colorless. In Burkina Faso, the crisis had become catastrophic. Over 3 million people without reliable access to water, entire towns migrating in desperation, mothers feeding dust to their children in place of bread. Aerial footage showed rivers as ribbons of bone-dry sediment, reservoirs sinking into shadows, aid trucks immobilized in scorching terrain. But what made the silence unbearable wasn't just the scale of the suffering, it was the indifference. The very nations that had extracted Africa's minerals, oil, and groundwater for profit were now watching from climate-controlled offices as the land they stripped cried out. It wasn't a drought, it was vengeance dressed as weather. And those who had never tasted thirst could not comprehend the scream in the soil. In response, a global emergency summit was hastily convened, not by the world's oldest powers, but by its boldest young leaders. This wasn't Davos. There were no suits for show, no empty applause. This was urgency, fire, resolve. Among the most commanding voices was President Ibrahim Traoré, barely into his 30s but already a symbol of sovereign defiance. He stood flanked by maps, data streams, and handwritten testimonies from dying farmers. Burkina Faso wasn't just a casualty, it was the epicenter. Traoré, once branded radical for nationalizing water infrastructure, was now being hailed as prophetic. But he needed the world to listen, and fast. And so, across oceans and ideologies, the summit organizers made a call that stunned Washington. Invite Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Not because she was the obvious choice, but because she wasn't. Because when America cut water access in rural Alabama and Flint, she fought. Because she didn't speak from podiums, she yelled from protest lines. And now, at a time when billionaires were buying bottled silence, she was the one voice too stubborn to ignore. The world had seen summits of polished speeches and marble stages, but this time, the most powerful messages came from broken ground and battered hearts, standing miles apart but bleeding from the same wound. The live feed opened with a brutal kind of honesty. No soft lighting, no filtered press room, just raw reality. The sun scorched the screen, casting sharp lines across President Ibrahim Traoré's face as he stood, not behind a podium, but in the center of a dead rice field in northern Burkina Faso. The land beneath him was no longer soil, it was cracked clay, deep fissured like the skin of a starving animal. This was once the economic heart of the region, where families harvested enough grain to feed cities. Now, not a blade of green remained. Behind Traoré, the skeletons of irrigation arms twisted like broken limbs against a lifeless horizon. Two barefoot children in tattered uniforms stood silently in the background, each clutching a yellow water container that hadn't been filled in days. There were no flags fluttering, no national anthem playing, only a keening wind that carried the dust of ruin. When Traoré finally spoke, his voice didn't rise. It fell, low, firm, unshaken by pity. This field, he said, lifting a handful of sun-baked dirt that sifted like ash through his fingers, once fed 20,000 people a year. Now it cannot even hold a shadow. He paused, eyes locked on the camera, as if daring the world to look away. Burkina Faso is not dying because of drought. Drought is nature. This, he gestured at the endless expanse of ruin, is the result of extraction without repair, trade without justice, aid without dignity. Behind him, a rusted water tank wheezed like an exhausted lung. A satellite tower blinked weakly in the distance. Out of signal, out of time. For a long moment, no one dared to speak. He wasn't asking for help. He was demanding responsibility. The second feed flickered to life from thousands of miles away, where Jasmine Crockett sat in a dim congressional side room in Washington, D.C., lit only by the blue glow of her laptop screen. Her blazer was rumpled, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows, her throat raw from a 10-hour floor battle that had just ended in a rare personal victory. She had stopped a water defunding bill dead in its tracks, a bill designed to quietly strip millions in federal support from America's poorest zip codes under the guise of reallocation. Her fingers were still stained with red Sharpie ink from the notes she'd scrawled in fury mid-debate. Stacked around her were manila folders marked with names like Flint, Jackson, East Street, Louis. She didn't need a stage. She had receipts. "I'm not speaking to you from a drought zone," she began, voice hoarse, lips dry. "But don't be mistaken. There is a war on water in my country, too." Her tone was steel. "Only we don't let the rivers dry. We poison them." She held up a photo, an 8-year-old girl holding a glass of brown tap water, face hollow, gums swollen. And when communities protest, they're told to wait, to boil, to pray. Her hand trembled, but her gaze did not. "So no, I'm not here as a politician. I'm here as someone who has fought tooth and nail to make sure my people don't have to choose between thirst and infection." She paused. "President Traoré stands in a field that the world abandoned. I stand in a nation that's still abandoning its own." Her final words hit like a blade through stone. Different geography, same betrayal. Jasmine inhaled slowly, almost as if steadying herself against a storm that hadn't passed, but had only gotten quieter, more invisible, more insidious. And then she said her name. "Her name was Tasha Monique Ellis," Jasmine said, her voice flattening into something deadly precise. 8 years old, 3rd grade, born and buried in Bullock County, Alabama. No press, no protest, just a casket barely 4 feet long. She held up a laminated photo, trembling slightly under the overhead light. The child in the image stared ahead, expression hollow, not out of shyness, but exhaustion. Her skin had turned a pale gray near the lips, her fingernails bluish with oxygen loss. The audience could see the hospital band on her wrist, the kind worn by the uninsured, issued, not printed. Jasmine's jaw tightened. This girl died because the well her family relied on was poisoned, with lead, iron bacteria, fecal contaminants, and God knows what else. The state called it a rural filtration deficiency. I call it negligent homicide by public policy. Her tone never rose, but every syllable was an indictment. No early warning, no replacement system, no emergency water truck, just a girl, burning with infection, vomiting blood by the 3rd day, and dead by the 5th. Her hand, still holding the photo, dropped to her side like a weapon she refused to holster. "And her crime?" she asked, staring down the lens. "Being born where the pipes don't reach, and where the votes don't count." The air in the summit chamber turned viscous, like time itself had thickened under the weight of what she said. "Don't tell me this is a global South problem," she continued, voice quieter now, but ironclad. "Tasha died in the most powerful country on earth, and no one even said her name on the House floor. No congressional moment of silence, no flag at half-mast, because her death wasn't dramatic enough. It was just slow, humiliating, and invisible." Her hand reached out and rested gently on the thick folder beside her, labeled U.S. Water Neglect Cases, Undisclosed. She didn't need to open it. "We bury our poor quietly in this country. We tell them the system failed, as if that system wasn't designed to forget them." Then after a long, blistering pause, she delivered the line that dropped like a blade. "We live in 2 different worlds, but we are dying of the same thing. Indifference made policy." Still holding Tasha's photo, Jasmine exhaled, then pivoted, not away from pain, but towards something far rarer in modern leadership: moral courage in the face of impossible temptation. "There's something I need to say," Jasmine began, her voice lower now, but every syllable was deliberate, like a judge preparing to read a verdict. "Because while the world drowns in indifference, there are people who choose to stand between their people and the jaws of profit." She looked directly at the screen that projected the summit's most unexpected figure. President Ibrahim Traoré, standing not in the halls of economic power, but in the dust of a country still fighting for air. Mr. President, she continued, you were offered a deal that could have changed your entire economic trajectory. A water rights contract from a European multinational syndicate. The numbers were dazzling. $412 million. Upfront, immediate. No strings they admitted to. She paused, not for dramatic effect, but because the reality of that number deserved to hang in the air like a live wire. You were told it would build roads, that it would modernize your grid, that it would employ hundreds. But what they didn't put in their press release was what they wanted in return: control of your subterranean aquifers for 30 years, bottling plants in foreign hands, export routes bypassing your own communities, and access clauses so airtight that even your own farmers would need to pay premiums to use water pulled from beneath their own land. She stepped forward now, her tone thick with both admiration and restrained fury. Most leaders in the world today would have signed that deal by sundown, smiled for the cameras, and told their people to be grateful for trickle-down charity. But you didn't, she said, her voice tightening. You read the fine print, and then you did something almost unheard of in modern governance. You said no. Her hands trembled slightly as she gestured toward him across the digital divide. You told them that water is not a commodity, that sovereignty is not for lease, that your people's thirst is not an investment opportunity. Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with uncontainable conviction. Do you know how rare that is? I've watched my own government buckle under lobbying worth a fraction of what they offered you. I've seen policymakers auction off the future for the price of one re-election cycle. She let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of that decision land on everyone in the room. You could have made yourself a global darling with one signature. You could have padded your GDP, shut your critics up, and smiled in every summit photo from here to Davos. Then she raised her hand, not to accuse, but to salute. But instead, you chose the child who walks 6 miles for a bucket of water, the elder who bathes once a week so her grandchildren can drink, the farmer who sees clouds but still plants, praying the soil will remember rain. You chose them. Her closing line wasn't delivered in triumph. It was spoken like a vow, heavy and still. You chose people with cracked lips over men with gold pens, and I have not seen a single G20 leader do the same. As Jasmine's final words echoed through the summit chamber, not a soul dared to speak, but in the silence the camera found him again. Not speaking, not nodding, simply still. President Ibrahim Traoré sat motionless, not out of politeness, not for effect, but because something inside him had shifted, something too heavy for language, too immediate for applause. The blistered wind swept across the dead field behind him, carrying dust into the creases of his uniform. But he didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed, not on the camera, not on the advisors frozen beside him, but far beyond, as if staring into the very future of his country, now trembling beneath the weight of Jasmine's words. To his left, a young aide leaned forward, uncertain, lips parting to speak, then stopping, struck dumb by the look on his president's face. It was the look of a man who had just had a wound named aloud in front of the world. The summit's moderator hesitated, unsure whether to transition to the next speaker. Even the signal technicians held their breath. And then it happened. A moment so small, it could have been missed by everyone. Except the camera never blinked. Traoré slowly reached into the inside pocket of his weather-worn jacket, pulled out an old pen with chipped paint near the grip, and without a word began unrolling the stiff cuff of his sleeve. No notepad, no tablet, no formal parchment. Just to his shirt, the very cloth touching his skin, was the surface he chose. With quiet, almost reverent precision, he pressed the pen against the fabric and began to write. The ink bled slightly on the linen, but he didn't stop. His hand trembled, not from nerves, but from knowing this moment could never be erased. He wrote a single line, paused, then underlined it twice, harder the second time, the tip of the pen nearly puncturing the cotton. The cameras couldn't catch the words, but they captured something deeper. A man marking his soul in cloth, not for show, but for memory. When he was done, he clenched the sleeve in his fist, folding the fabric like a vow, and looked back at the screen, his silence louder than any anthem. But there's a line between empathy and experience. And when Jasmine stepped back from global policy to speak from the scar tissue of her own past, the summit no longer felt like a diplomatic event. It felt like confession under fire. "I don't speak about this often," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a weight that made even microphones strain to catch it. "Because in rooms like these, we talk about percentages, budgets, impact reports. But poverty has no press release." Her fingers curled slowly around the edge of the podium, as though steadying herself against something rising from deep inside. "When I was a child, the water was shut off in our home for almost 3 months. Not once. Not during a freak storm. Not because the city failed, but because we were invisible. We didn't matter enough for someone to fix the meter, or forgive the overdue bill, or even answer the phone." She swallowed hard. The taps didn't drip. They hissed like they were mocking us. Every faucet was a reminder that survival had to be improvised. Her breath caught slightly before she continued. "My mother, God, she tried. Every day, she'd walk half a mile to the retention pond behind the old supermarket. There were cigarette butts floating in it, frogs nesting. One summer, the carcass of a raccoon rotted on the edge. She knew it wasn't safe, but when you have a child crying from hunger, you don't wait for safe. You pray over dangerous and hope it's enough." Her voice started to fracture, but she refused to stop. She used an old white t-shirt to strain the pond water. Then she'd stir it into powdered rice, sometimes with canned peas if the church pantry had extras that week. "That's what I ate. Not because she failed, but because the system failed her." She looked up, eyes burning, not with tears, but with defiance carved from memory. "Do you know what it feels like to sit in a classroom knowing your skin smells like mildew? To avoid drinking during school hours because you're scared the teacher will notice your lips cracking? To wake up at night and listen for water, not because you expect it, but because somewhere in your heart, you still believe maybe the faucet will change its mind?" She leaned forward, eyes locking into the camera like crosshairs. "That kind of humiliation doesn't wash off. It embeds in your bones. And no politician, no bureaucrat, no diplomat, no economist can understand it unless they've knelt beside a rusted bathtub, holding a plastic bucket, praying rainwater will come before another week begins." She had spoken of shame, of pond water and sleepless nights. But now her voice rose not just from memory, but from conviction forged in battle, as she turned to the room and set her eyes on the world's most powerful players. "If there is still one place on this planet," Jasmine said, voice steady and unblinking, "where human dignity is placed above resource value, then that place is called Burkina Faso." The room fell even quieter. Delegates froze mid-note. Technicians stopped their adjustments. The entire summit leaned closer, as if they knew something monumental was about to pass through the air, and feared missing it. She wasn't shouting, but her words hit like stone against glass. "At a time when nations are measuring the worth of land by what they can dig out of it, there stands one country that said no, no to foreign hands mapping out aquifers like oil fields. No to billion-dollar development deals that leave people thirsty at the edge of sparkling export plants. No to the idea that life-giving water should belong to the highest bidder." Her hands gripped the podium now, not for balance, but as if she were anchoring herself in truth. "You see," she continued, her tone sharpening, "Burkina Faso was offered everything short of a crown. Multinational syndicates lined up at their door with contracts wrapped in gold. $412 million. Private water extraction rights, foreign infrastructure, debt forgiveness, prestige at summits like this one. All they had to do was sign over the right to their own veins, the rivers beneath their soil." She paused for a long, breathless second. "And they said no." She looked directly at the screen projecting President Traoré's solemn figure. "You, sir, put your people before your profit. You chose children with cracked lips over shareholders with polished shoes. You chose wells that still belong to villagers over vaults that would have silenced them forever. And I've watched world leaders sign away far more for far less." Her voice darkened, tinged with both sorrow and contempt. "In Washington, I've seen members of Congress fold over a check worth $10,000. I've watched entire committees bend to fossil fuel giants who can't even pronounce the names of the communities they poison. But here you are, standing in the dust of a scorched nation, refusing to sell what little you have left, because what you have left is sacred. She stepped back, her chest heaving slightly, then took a breath, not to calm herself, but to strike deeper. So to the wealthy nations, the G7 members, the global investors, the ones who sit in towers and boardrooms and think the world is still a chessboard, I'm talking to you now. Her eyes narrowed. Stop buying land in Africa just to steal its water. Stop calling it strategic acquisition when it's resource colonialism in a new suit. Stop pushing contracts that give your corporations 30-year water access rights while the children in those villages walk 6 miles with empty buckets. Stop pretending your development aid isn't just a dam built upstream with a lock and key held in Zurich. The room was breathless. Cameras panned slowly across the faces of diplomats who no longer scribbled in notebooks. Jasmine raised her voice, not to shout, but to pierce. You do not have the right to bottle another country's rainfall and ship it to supermarkets in Europe. You do not have the right to drain lakes in Malawi, in Burkina Faso, in Kenya, just to stock private reservoirs for your golf courses and luxury spas. You do not get to treat water like a commodity when it is the very breath of the earth. She leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lowering but becoming even more dangerous in its precision. This is not an appeal to your charity. This is a warning. Because if you keep treating African soil like your emergency reserve tank, if you keep stockpiling water while people collapse in line for rationed gallons, then don't ask why those same people rise up and say, enough. She paused. The silence was total. Then she ended, not with a plea, but with a sentence that broke through diplomatic pretense like a steel blade through silk. Stop locking life in vaults. Let the water flow to the people who thirst, not the people who speculate. And for a moment in that heavily guarded, air-conditioned chamber of power, the world stopped pretending it didn't hear her. Jasmine's final words still trembled in the air, like the echo of a verdict when the silence was broken. Not by applause, not by protocol, but by a man rising slowly into the full weight of history, knowing that his next words would not just be heard, they would be recorded by time. I was not going to speak again today, President Ibrahim Traoré said, his voice low, grave, carrying not the rehearsed rhythm of diplomacy, but the sharp stillness of conviction formed under pressure. But Congresswoman Crockett has spoken a truth so raw, so precise, that it would be cowardice not to respond. He didn't gesture. He didn't smile. He simply stood, tall, dust clinging to his cuffs, the sun from the Sahel bleaching his uniform to near bone white. His aides did not move. The teleprompter remained dark. This was not scripted. It was a rupture. So I will speak now, not as a president, but as a son of a land where water is not a commodity. It is a matter of dignity or death. His eyes scanned the summit screens, not with contempt, but with challenge. And because I know what it means to be left behind, I am choosing not to leave others behind. He stepped forward once, just enough to fill the center of the camera's frame. Not to dominate, but to be seen without filter. Burkina Faso will make our entire national water database open source. Every survey, every underground map, every seasonal fluctuation recorded by hand in village journals. We will release all our research on low-cost biofiltration methods, perfected by rural engineers using charcoal, clay, and crushed moringa seeds. We will share our reforestation blueprints, rainfall harvest models, and solar-powered irrigation systems, even the ones still unfinished. He paused, letting the magnitude of his words sink in. And we will share this knowledge, not with contracts, not with licenses, but freely, without precondition, without privilege, even with those whose flags once flew above our soil, because justice is not vengeance, and leadership is not leverage. A hush spread like a pressure wave through the room. His voice neither rose nor faltered. It simply pressed deeper. We have been robbed before, of minerals, of time, of language. But what we have rebuilt through suffering will not become the new currency of division. It will become a bridge. He drew a breath, jaw tight. Let it be known, Burkina Faso will stand with every nation too small to be heard, too poor to be noticed, too colonized to be trusted. His eyes sharpened as he delivered the final sentence, not with emotion, but with a certainty that struck like lightning through still water. We remember who exploited us, but we will not become them. We will not hoard the rain while others burn. But while the room still reeled from his final sentence, President Traoré moved, not with flourish, but with finality, toward an act that would turn his words into law and his defiance into a global reckoning. The camera locked on him just as the dust kicked up behind his boots, framing a moment that didn't need amplification, only silence. Ibrahim Traoré didn't speak. He didn't consult anyone. Instead, he turned with calm certainty and reached for the battered leather case that had traveled with him to more village councils than international summits. He opened it without ceremony, revealing a single document inside, a national decree, pre-drafted, unsigned, its contents still unknown to every other leader in the room. The air around him thickened. Aides took half steps forward, unsure if they should intervene. But one glance from his side halted them cold. The cameras tightened. The live broadcast surged as viewership climbed by the second. Traoré unfastened the pen clipped to his chest, a gift from a teacher in Yatenga province, its lacquer chipped, the metal warm from his skin. With slow, unshaking hands, he laid the decree flat against a collapsible wooden lectern, a small gust catching the corner like the breath of something sacred. Then he raised the pen in full view of the summit's global feed, not for show, but so that the world would witness what it had waited too long to see, a leader who didn't ask for permission to do what was just. The tip of the pen met the paper, and with one bold, deliberate motion, he signed his name across the bottom. Not small, not bureaucratic, but large, slashing, permanent. One line, then a second, then a final dot that hit like a period at the end of an era. The moment detonated online before the ink had dried. Newsrooms scrambled to verify, but it was already too late. The act had been broadcast, raw and unedited. There was no spin, no press release, no translation needed. The world had seen what mattered. A man with no podium, no teleprompter, no armored convoy, just a piece of paper, a broken pen, and the authority of someone who had chosen solidarity over sovereignty and justice over revenge. For the first time in decades, a sub-Saharan leader had declared not war, not withdrawal, but open generosity in the face of historical betrayal. In villages across the Sahel, crowds gathered around battery-powered radios, listening not for promises, but for the silence that follows when something irreversible has just been set in motion. In European capitals, analysts scrambled to interpret the consequences. What it would mean if data, filtration models, and infrastructure designs were no longer part of the bidding war, but freely available to the very nations once locked out of survival. And in the eyes of those who had suffered in quiet, forgotten corners of the planet, that image, Traoré's hand over paper, unshaken, unowned, was not just a policy. It was proof that dignity could be legislated in real time. The cameras may have stopped rolling in Burkina Faso, but in Washington, the blowback had just begun. And Jasmine Crockett, now back on American soil, found herself standing in the crosshairs of a storm she had long seen coming. The headlines hit like a slow-moving ambush. First came the op-eds, thinly veiled under the language of national interest and optics. Then the cable segments. Then the congressional floor. One by one, American lawmakers lined up to condemn her, not for lying, but for telling a truth they refused to hear. A sitting member of Congress praising a foreign autocrat, barked one senator from Texas, eyes gleaming under studio lights. It's not diplomacy, it's disgrace. Another accused her of romanticizing failed states. Others took it further, questioning her patriotism outright. How dare she applaud a regime while criticizing her own country? One headline screamed. They weren't offended by what she said. They were threatened by what it revealed. That a nation claiming moral authority had, in fact, lost its moral memory. Jasmine didn't flinch, but she felt it. The same hands that once applauded her for challenging injustice now pointed fingers, furious that she had applauded someone outside the circle of approved allies. In the corridors of Capitol Hill, she was met with stares colder than the marble. Colleagues who once clapped during her floor speeches now turned their backs in elevators. A private memo leaked from a Senate aide accused her of undermining America's global standing by legitimizing third world populism. The phrase stung, not because it was new, but because it echoed a deeper rot she had known since childhood. The quiet belief that dignity was something white and imported, not black and sovereign. Cable networks ran the same 10-second clip in a loop, her saying Traoré's name, her praising his decision to reject corporate water contracts, her calling Burkina Faso a beacon of moral clarity, edited without context, voiced over with manufactured outrage. A beacon of moral clarity? One pundit sneered. What about our military bases, our global aid? But none of them mentioned the part where Traoré shared water filtration technology with countries too poor to buy it. None replayed the clip of him signing that decree. What they feared wasn't her praise. It was the possibility that she meant every word. Then came the moment they didn't expect. Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat. She didn't issue a clarification. She didn't step behind a staffer-written statement. She went on live television. The network had offered her a 7-minute slot on a morning program known for softball interviews and safe talking points. She walked in with no notes, no PR handler, no soft smile, just the fire she'd carried from the red soil of the Sahel back into the halls of American hypocrisy. Under studio lights, her face was bare, uncompromising. The host, visibly uneasy, tried to ease into the controversy with pre-scripted neutrality. Congresswoman Crockett, some of your colleagues have expressed concern that your comments in support of President Traoré may have crossed a line, particularly given the sensitive nature of international diplomacy. Do you regret your statement? She didn't blink. I regret nothing, she said, each word slicing through the air like it had been waiting in her chest for years. What I said was not flattery, it was fact. I watched a man stand in the middle of a dying rice field and give away everything he had, not to secure power, but to protect life. I watched him sign away profit so his people could drink clean water without fear. Her tone didn't rise, it didn't need to. If that unsettles my colleagues, they should ask themselves why basic human dignity looks foreign to them. The host shifted, but she leaned in. I've been told I embarrassed this country by applauding an African president. But I've watched this country ignore poison towns, bankrupt school districts, and families rationing insulin like it's gold. So let's talk about embarrassment. She paused, and in that pause, the air turned electric. We send billions to regimes that butcher journalists. We sell weapons to governments that bomb hospitals. But the moment I call a black African leader ethical, suddenly it's treason. There was no music, no applause track, just the sound of her breathing, steady and razor-edged. Then she delivered the line that would tear through every screen in the country. If the truth makes you uncomfortable, then maybe the problem isn't what was said. It's what it reveals about you. She let it hang. You want to call it un-American? Fine. But ask yourself, what part of justice is un-American? What part of moral courage is un-American? Because if admiring a man who puts people above profit is now considered radical, then the problem isn't me. It's the standard you've set for patriotism. The anchor tried to pivot, something about optics, about context. But it didn't matter. The truth had already detonated. By the time she left the studio, her phone had exploded with texts from civil rights leaders, from small-town mayors, from teachers in underfunded schools, from mothers in places like Flint and Jackson and Baton Rouge. Thank you for saying it, they wrote. Thank you for not apologizing. One message stood out. It came from a community organizer in Detroit. You didn't just defend him. You defended us all, because we've been told our heroes don't look like that. And Jasmine knew then, this wasn't about one speech. It was about a line that had finally been crossed. A boundary pushed not with rage, but with clarity. Not with rebellion, but with truth. And that truth had teeth. And it wasn't going back in the cage. While the political world spun in outrage and commentary, far from the chambers of Congress and the echo chambers of television, the voices that truly mattered began to rise. Not from podiums, but from dry earth and scarred hands, in the language of gratitude carved by survival. In the early hours of dawn, When the Sahel wind still carried a faint trace of coolness before the sun turned it into fire, Binta began her climb. She was over 60. No one knew her exact age, not even herself. But her spine was straight, and her feet knew the rocks by memory. In one hand, she carried a blue plastic water jug, worn smooth by years of use. In the other, she held a tool, a piece of sharp iron salvaged from a broken plow. With every step, her breath grew louder, not from fatigue, but from something heavier, something holy. She didn't speak. She didn't ask for help. She walked up that mountain alone, past crumbling footpaths and old trees that hadn't seen leaves in seasons. At the summit, she knelt, and with fingers calloused from decades of pounding grain, she began to etch words into the jug's hardened shell. "Jasmine, we heard your voice from across the ocean." The engraving took over an hour. The wind tore at her headscarf. Dust stung her eyes. Blood rose in her knuckles where the iron slipped. But she didn't stop. She pressed each letter into the plastic like it was stone. This wasn't a performance. No camera crew, no reporters. Just an old woman, a water jug, and the name of a stranger who, for the first time in her life, had spoken into a microphone and said, "You matter." When she finished, she held the jug above her head, the words catching the first rays of sunlight. And for a moment, on that silent ridge above a silent village, it was as if the earth itself had answered back. 2 miles below, in a one-room school built of tin sheets and mud bricks, a boy named Maury sat with a pencil clutched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was 8. His uniform was torn at the collar, his sandals held together with wire. But his posture was perfect, as if the act of writing required discipline. Around him, other students giggled and whispered, but Maury didn't lift his head. On a wrinkled sheet of paper pulled from the back of an old workbook, he was drafting something rare. A letter. Not for a grade, not for an assignment. For someone he'd never met, but now considered his reason for dreaming. He had watched the summit on a rusted battery-powered radio with his father, the village caretaker. The translation was spotty, the signal fuzzy, but he'd heard one name repeated again and again. Jasmine. The woman who spoke like thunder, the one who stood beside his president and said the world needed to learn from a country the world had tried to forget. After the summit, Maury's father told him, "That woman has never been to our village, but she fights for it anyway." That night, Maury didn't sleep. He stared at the stars and thought about water, about wells, about the line of people every morning who came to fill their buckets while his father turned the old pump by hand. Now, as the classroom filled with heat and flies, he bent over the page and pressed each word into the paper like a vow. "My name is Maury. I am in 2nd grade. I want to be like President Traoré when I grow up. I want to protect the well in our village, because it gives us life. I want to make sure no one takes it, not even people with money. Thank you for fighting with us. Thank you for saying we are strong. Please do not forget us. I will not forget you." He folded the page carefully, sealing it inside the torn envelope of an old electricity bill. He had never sent a letter before, didn't even know how mail worked, but he didn't care. He brought it to his teacher and asked, voice barely above a whisper, "Can this go to America?" The teacher smiled gently, tears rising uninvited. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe it already has." Outside, a group of women waited in the dust for their turn at the hand pump. One of them held a jerry can with Binta's engraving. The words had already begun to fade under the morning glare, but the name, Jasmine, remained bold and sharp. One of the younger women traced it with her finger and whispered, "She said the water belongs to us, not to them." Another replied, "She said our pain is not too small to speak aloud." And that was how it spread. Not with hashtags, not with headlines, but in whispers passed from mother to daughter, from son to father, from well to fire pit. A name, a voice, a moment that had crossed oceans and struck not at the centers of power, but at the edges of survival, where people didn't need slogans. They needed someone to look into a camera and say, "You matter. I see you. I will not let them forget you." And from that point on, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a name in the news. She was a carved word on a water jug. She was a line in a child's letter. She was the voice that reached where power never had. But sometimes words do not belong only in speeches or headlines. They must be carved into the earth, into stone, into monuments that cannot be erased, so that those who live at the margins remember, and those in power are forced to. In the northern desert plains of Burkina Faso, where the sun crushed the horizon with a slow, merciless hand, and the wind blew red with sand, a convoy of workers moved across the dust like ants towards something ancient in spirit, but brand new in form. They weren't building a dam or digging another well. They were delivering a monolith. A single slab of granite, quarried from the country's interior, had been transported by truck over 400 kilometers to a place where no foreign executive, no diplomat, no mining magnate would bother to go, because there was nothing to take, until now. President Ibrahim Traoré had chosen the location himself. It was not symbolic, it was personal. This was the exact stretch of land where, 6 years earlier, a European energy consortium had proposed to build a groundwater extraction facility, promising jobs, power, and prosperity. Instead, after protest and resistance, the land remained untouched. The only thing ever taken from it was dignity, and now something would be given back. The workers lowered the stone onto its foundation, just as the wind kicked up a curtain of sand that half blinded the camera crews. But the words engraved on the face of the stone refused to disappear. The carving had been done by hand. Each letter measured 5 inches tall. It didn't carry a government seal or a party insignia, just the quote, chiseled so deep that not even a century of storms could wear it away. Water is not a privilege. It is a human right. Jasmine Crockett. Traoré arrived not in a motorcade, but on foot, escorted by local village elders and barefoot children who had walked 3 miles to see what had only been spoken of on radios. He placed his hand on the stone as if to feel the heat it had absorbed from the sun. "This is not just for us," he said quietly to the press gathered around. "It's for those who come after, and those who will never be mentioned in any history book." He did not give a long speech. He didn't need to. The stone said everything. Word spread fast, not through government channels, but through grainy WhatsApp videos and transistor radios. In schools, teachers paused lessons and told students to memorize the sentence. In markets, women passed around photographs like sacred scrolls. Farmers who couldn't read traced the letters with their fingers and asked their sons to recite the phrase out loud. In a land where water had been rationed, sold, and hoarded, the idea that someone across the ocean had said you deserve this, not because you're useful, but because you're human, that was the revolution. But it didn't stop there. 12 days later and 6,000 miles away, under the steel sky of Washington, D.C., another slab was rising, this time in the most politically charged patch of land in America, Capitol Hill. Jasmine Crockett had remained silent through the backlash, through the editorials and the veiled accusations. But she hadn't been idle. She had commissioned a replica, smaller in size but identical in message, to be installed on a patch of public space facing the eastern steps of Congress. It was made of black Vermont slate, chosen not for prestige but for contrast. Against the white stone buildings of American power, the blackness would scream. The installation happened quietly, at dawn. No ribbon cutting, no ceremony, just a crew of local stonemasons and volunteers, many from D.C.'s most neglected wards, who showed up to work because this one feels like it's for us. A child from Anacostia helped sweep the base. A retired librarian brought flowers. And as the final bolts locked into place, the same words emerged into morning light, etched in English and underneath it in Fulfulde, the regional tongue of northern Burkina Faso. Water is not a privilege. It is a human right. The reaction was nuclear. By 8:43 a.m., congressional aides were photographing it in disbelief. By 9:12 a.m., a House Republican from Missouri was calling it an unauthorized political monument promoting foreign regimes. By noon, 3 conservative think tanks had issued statements condemning it as anti-capitalist graffiti in stone. But by sunset, it was surrounded by candles. Not just activists, not just journalists, but veterans, nurses, bus drivers, mothers, janitors, people who had lived through boil notices, dry taps, unfiltered lead, People who didn't care where Burkina Faso was on a map, but knew exactly what it meant to be told your basic needs were a luxury. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Not until day 3. She stepped onto the plaza not flanked by security, but by residents from Flint, from Jackson, from the Bronx. She stood beneath her own words, not to explain them, but to amplify them. Reporters swarmed, cameras clicked, but her voice cut clean through. This is not about another country, she said. This is about every place where people line up for water like it's bread and wartime. It's about every politician who sees infrastructure as an afterthought. It's about every child who has to choose between brushing their teeth and saving a bottle for school. She turned toward the Capitol behind her, cold and silent in the early light. If these words make some people uncomfortable, good. Let them be uncomfortable, because for too long, comfort has been built on someone else's thirst. She didn't stay long. She didn't need to. By that evening, someone had chalked "thank you" in 6 languages across the sidewalk around the monument. A choir from a local school sang Sam Cooke's "A Change Is Gonna Come." An undocumented grandmother left a jug of clean water with a note. This time, we give. Inside the Capitol, debate swirled. Lawmakers argued over its legality, its message, its optics. One senator called for its removal. Another offered to protect it under free speech law. One aide reportedly muttered, "This isn't just a rock, it's a damn indictment." And it was. Not because it accused, but because it existed, boldly, defiantly, undeniably, in the very heart of a system that had forgotten who democracy was supposed to serve. It didn't matter whether they liked it. The stone would stay, just like the one in the desert, just like the truth it carried, just like the people it honored. The stone remained unmoved, untouched, but it was never silent. And as its message echoed from desert winds to DC sidewalks, something began to shift beneath the noise. Not policy, but purpose. And not from politicians, but from the people they had long ignored. It began, as most revolutions do, not with speeches or signatures, but with whispers, passed through dirt roads, kitchen tables, factory floors, and overcrowded clinics. The stone outside Capitol Hill had not been touched, but the ripple it unleashed moved with force through corridors that thought themselves untouchable. The world had seen enough summits filled with nothing but polished lies. What it craved now was action, substance, sweat, steel, and it came, not from parliaments or presidents, but from the people who had spent their lives walking to wells, boiling silence into resistance. 1 year later to the day, under a sky bruised with storm clouds and tension, 4 nations gathered not beneath a UN banner, not in a gilded ballroom, but in the open-air courtyard of a community-built water research center on the outskirts of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. There was no red carpet, no black SUVs, just tarps strung between poles, farmers and engineers side by side, and rows of folding chairs filled not with donors but with doers, those who had survived water injustice and lived long enough to fight it back. They called it the Global Flow Accord, but on the ground people had already renamed it in their own tongues. Le Fleuve du Peuple, La Corriente del Pueblo, the flow of the people. It was not a treaty of convenience. It was a reckoning in ink. For the first time, the United States, Burkina Faso, Ghana, and Peru were signing a legally binding multilateral civilian-driven agreement, not just to protect water, but to liberate it, to shield it from profit motives, to exchange ideas across oceans without charging licensing fees, to create an unbreakable pipeline of knowledge, protection, and defense around the most sacred resource humanity had left. The tension was palpable. This was not a feel-good ceremony. It was a declaration against an entrenched order. Behind the smiles were threats. The IMF had issued 3 veiled warnings. 3 major agricultural conglomerates had pulled lobbying dollars from the deal. One foreign minister had walked out the week before. But the people stayed. They filled the chairs. They stood behind the cameras. They brought their children and their buckets, their letters and their broken promises, and they came to witness what many said was impossible. An alliance that owed nothing to banks and everything to survival. Jasmine Crockett stood beneath the tarp in a simple navy blouse, her sleeves rolled, her eyes unwavering. Across from her stood President Traoré, weathered but proud, surrounded by his engineers, his village elders, his barefoot witnesses. Beside them, the health minister of Peru wiped rain off his clipboard. The Ghanaian delegate, a former rural teacher, held the hand of a boy who had nearly died in a cholera outbreak the year before. These were not dignitaries. They were insurgents in suits, builders in boots, defenders of dignity who knew that water did not care about borders, and neither should those who protect it. A moderator approached the table. He didn't speak in diplomatic platitudes. He simply read the first clause aloud. Article 1. Water is a shared inheritance of humanity. No nation, corporation, or institution may restrict access to knowledge that protects it, purifies it, or defends it. That was the start. Clause after clause followed, each one forged from real wounds. Article 3. No filtration design patented by signatory nations may be sold to another developing nation at a profit. Article 7. Community water defenders shall be granted asylum in any signatory state if persecuted for their work. Article 10. A joint emergency fund shall be activated within 72 hours of any water crisis, bypassing traditional aid bureaucracies. By the time the final article was read, the storm above had begun to break. Rain fell, not in sheets, but in rhythm. Not enough to drown voices, but just enough to remind everyone why they were there. People did not scatter. They lifted their faces to the sky and let the water bless the moment. One grandmother from Ghana whispered, "Let the paper get wet. Let the ink run, so long as the promise holds." When the time came to sign, no one reached for gold pens. Instead, each leader stepped forward and dipped a simple wooden quill into a bowl of purified stormwater, a symbol drawn from a ritual in the Andean highlands, where elders once signed declarations of peace with water collected from their most sacred lagoons. Jasmine was the last to step forward. As she dipped the quill into the basin, her reflection wavered on the surface, fractured by each raindrop, but her hand was steady. She signed, Jasmine Crockett, on behalf of the people who were told their thirst didn't matter. As the ink dried, reporters jostled for statements, but Jasmine didn't give a soundbite. She stepped down from the platform and walked into the crowd, toward the water defenders, the school children, the engineers with dirt still on their hands. She shook hands. She hugged a woman who'd lost her son during a typhoid outbreak linked to unfiltered runoff. She knelt beside a farmer who had donated his land to build the community well. And then, without warning, someone handed her a metal bucket with a message scratched into it in 2 languages. We remember who poisoned us, but today we choose to heal together. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper, chanting, words rising not from joy alone, but from exhaustion, vindication, fury turned into purpose. Inside the press tent, a Western correspondent turned to his producer and whispered, "This isn't diplomacy. This is a jailbreak." And it was, because outside the polished chambers of power, a new kind of treaty had just been born, one with no lobbyists, no loopholes, no lifeless slogans, one carved from scars, one written with rain, and its name wasn't coined in a conference room. It was whispered into every cracked pipeline, every rusted faucet, every well run dry. The flow of the people, and this time it would not be dammed. Under the shadow of that rain-soaked signing ceremony, with the ink still drying on a document forged by history and hunger, a new world began to whisper itself into being. But in Washington, D.C., thousands of miles from Ouagadougou, where the walls of power are thicker and colder, not everyone was ready to listen. As the press assembled in the Capitol briefing room, clutching cameras, pads, and pre-written headlines, Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium, not as a politician or policy architect, but as a woman who had just watched something extraordinary. A nation once dismissed as fragile had stood taller than the world's richest empires, simply by choosing its people over its profits. She was dressed in charcoal gray, her voice calm, but beneath the stillness lived a quiet storm. The microphones clicked on, the lights flared, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned forward, eyes sweeping across the room, and then, almost disarmingly, she smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smile of someone who had fought too long to believe in miracles and just witnessed one anyway. I didn't think my words would change anything that day, she began, her tone steady, pulling the room into absolute silence. I thought they would land like they usually do, in a void, buried beneath committee reports and headlines about celebrity divorces. I spoke because silence would have hurt more, not because I believed the world would listen. The room sat breathless. Even the reporters trained to chase scandal, not soul, lowered their pens. But then, she continued, voice lowering, a president in a land parched by history did something I've never seen a G20 leader do. He didn't seize power. He didn't hoard water. He didn't ask what was profitable or politically convenient. He heard the voice of someone far away with no strategic leverage and said, "This matters." Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from magnitude. President Traoré made the world believe that dignity could flow like water, through borders, across time zones, beneath the feet of those who were told they were voiceless. At that line, the flashbulbs exploded, but Jasmine didn't pause. She kept going, the rhythm rising, every word like a wave crashing against the shore of a system too long anchored in cynicism. "When we met on that screen, I didn't see a foreign leader," she said. "I saw a mirror, a reflection of every child in Alabama who drank lead before they could spell the word injustice, of every grandmother in Ouagadougou who walks 6 miles for a bucket of water and still manages to sing. I saw someone who didn't just govern, but who grieved, who hoped, who dared to believe that global power doesn't come from stockpiles, but from sacrifice." She took a breath. One slow, trembling breath. And then her eyes locked with the CNN reporter in the front row. "You all asked me why I praised him. You asked me if that was unpatriotic. You asked me if it was appropriate. So let me answer. I praised him because, for once, someone chose people over pipelines. And if that makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why the truth feels like a betrayal." Gasps rippled, not from outrage, from awe. Even those who'd come looking to twist her words found themselves frozen, because what she delivered was not spin, but testimony. The moderator tried to move to the next question. Jasmine raised her hand. "I'm not done." Another hush. "I've sat in rooms where black women were talked over, where the poor were erased, where water policy was debated like a luxury, not a lifeline. But that day, the world paused. And for once, it listened to a voice it was never supposed to hear. Not because I was loud, but because someone with power chose to make space. And then, the line that wasn't planned, the one that history would remember more than any soundbite. Traoré reminded us that dignity doesn't trickle down. It floods up, from the cracks we've tried to hide, from the voices we've tried to silence, from the deserts we've abandoned. And now that it's begun, I dare you to try and stop it. You could hear the shudder in the room. Not applause, not yet. Just a silence that was earned, the kind that comes only when truth collides with expectation and leaves it in ruins. C-SPAN replayed the segment 12 times in 24 hours. Social media didn't trend it. They studied it. The press didn't spin it. They quoted it word for word. Because in that moment, Jasmine Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman. She was the conduit for a global current that had finally found its course. And somewhere, far from the cameras, in a desert where that sacred stone still stood, etched with the words, "Water is not a privilege, it is a human right," an old woman poured a tin cup into the soil, letting the water seep down like a prayer. She didn't say anything, but the land did. And somewhere else, in a Capitol office once deaf to struggle, a young staffer walked past that replica stone and paused. He touched the surface, whispered, "Let it flow." And it did. And when the cameras dimmed and the speeches faded into memory, something deeper lingered in the silence. A lesson not written into treaties or shouted from podiums, but carved into the marrow of 2 lives that dared to defy the system. It was in that quiet aftermath, after the declarations and applause, that the true weight of what had unfolded began to settle, not just between Crockett and Traoré, not just between Washington and Ouagadougou, but within the fault lines of a world that had long forgotten the price of dignity. Because this wasn't a story about aid. It wasn't about diplomacy or optics or headlines. It was about who gets to matter, about whether a child drinking from a poisoned well in Alabama deserves the same urgency as a child chasing a bucket of dust in Burkina Faso. And more than that, it was about the violence of indifference, the kind that wears suits, signs budgets, and calls its cruelty policy. The kind that Jasmine Crockett had faced since the first time she testified about water rations and saw congressional eyes glaze over like she was speaking a different language. Traoré, too, knew that language. The language of being overlooked. He had once been a soldier with no microphone, no audience, just sand in his boots and dead silence from the world. But now, with one sentence and one refusal to sign away his country's aquifers, he had rewritten the moral hierarchy of power and taught something no G7 summit ever had the courage to say: moral leadership does not belong to those with wealth, but to those willing to sacrifice comfort for justice. The lesson was brutal. It exposed who had always been allowed to define humanity, and who had always been expected to survive without it. Jasmine had once fought just to keep a poor district's water flowing. Now she stood at the center of a global current, but the backlash came just as fast. In the days after the summit, pundits sneered. Political enemies called her a traitor to the flag for elevating an African president over American leaders. One senator even accused her of exporting shame, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that telling the truth was always interpreted as rebellion when you weren't supposed to have a voice. She responded not with anger, but with clarity. If truth insults you, she told MSNBC, you should ask yourself why your comfort relies on silence. And that sentence, just 12 words, rippled further than any press release. It landed in classrooms, in protests, in the minds of people who had never before connected their dry faucets to someone else's overflowing vault. It reframed the idea of global connection, not as charity, but as responsibility. And that, perhaps, was the final lesson. That dignity cannot be localized. You cannot protect your own humanity while turning your back on someone else's. You cannot hoard clean water behind walls and expect to sleep at night knowing a child died from thirst just because they were born on the wrong side of an ocean. What Traoré and Jasmine ignited wasn't a political alliance. It was a confrontation with conscience, a demand that the world stop ranking whose suffering is profitable and whose is expendable. In the end, it wasn't about Burkina Faso or the United States. It was about the question echoing beneath every silence, every budget cut, every ignored village, and every dismissed girl with a cracked voice and a bucket in her hand. How much longer will we pretend that justice can exist without equality of survival? And when the next drought comes, when the next hearing opens, and someone dares to ask what a glass of water is worth, someone, somewhere, will remember that day. That one woman from Texas and one soldier from West Africa didn't wait for permission to change the answer. They gave it to the world, and now the world must choose what to do with it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Inside a high-stakes congressional hearing, Jasmine Crockett faces off against Mike Pompeo over a question that could define the soul of the nation. Should billions be poured into steel and surveillance while basic healthcare collapses? One speaks of borders insecurity, the other of children dying without insulin. Tension cuts through the air as personal stories clash with political ambition, and in silence falls when a single line exposes everything. The room shifts, reputations teeter, and when the cameras zoom in, will Pompeo admit he traded American lives for 100 miles of steel? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Capitol chamber pulsed with restrained tension, the kind that settles like smoke before a storm breaks. Every seat was filled: senators, representatives, aides, press, lobbyists. The overhead lights burned sterile and bright, but nothing could mask the heat that hung over the room like a silent warning. Cameras slid on their rails, scanning the arena of American power. One lens zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett, stone-faced, eyes forward, a crimson folder anchored beneath her steady hands. Across from her sat Mike Pompeo, a man carved from granite and ego, adjusting his tie with the confidence of someone used to writing history, not answering for it. He looked past her, never at her, like she wasn't the storm about to crash through his walls. The chairman cleared his throat, voice echoing against marble and tension. This hearing of the United States House Oversight Committee is now in session. Today's topic: the federal budget's prioritization of border security over community health care. The cameras didn't miss it. How Crockett didn't flinch, didn't blink, as if her stillness was its own weapon. Pompeo shifted once in his seat, ever so slightly, but the gesture was caught, magnified, broadcast live to 18 million homes. There were murmurs, the soft cough of discomfort in the rows behind. Everyone in the chamber knew what was at stake, but few had the stomach to say it aloud, that the richest country in human history was choosing steel and surveillance over insulin and survival. Jasmine knew. She had read the letters, held the hospital reports, memorized the obituaries. The folder on her desk didn't contain statistics. It contained names, lives, children, dead not because of war, but because of spreadsheets and cold men in suits pretending tough choices were noble ones. The silence still clung to the chamber like static electricity when Mike Pompeo finally leaned forward. It was the slow, deliberate movement of a man who'd addressed nations, briefed military brass, and made life-and-death decisions over coffee and classified folders. He adjusted the microphone, not out of necessity, but to signal one thing: he was in control. Then, with the calm confidence of someone too seasoned to shout, he began. "A nation," he said, his voice cutting through the air like the slow draw of a blade, "cannot survive without borders." Sentence landed with the weight of doctrine. There was no emotion, no raised voice, only that terrifying calm that often cloaks the most dangerous intentions. He didn't look at Jasmine Crockett, not yet. His eyes drifted upward, locking briefly with the cameras. The message wasn't just for the chamber, it was for the country. This is not about politics. This is about permanence. This republic, our republic, was not built to be wide open. We were never meant to be undefended. He paused, not because he lost his place, but because he understood rhythm, timing, the power of silence when used like a weapon. And $25 billion, he continued, letting the number stretch across the chamber like a shadow, is not a cost. It is an insurance policy for the very idea of America. There was no applause, but there wasn't a single sound of objection either, for now he had the room. He shifted slightly, placing one palm down, flat on the table. Gold wedding band on his hand caught the overhead light, a small, humanizing detail, almost designed. But nothing about this man was accidental. "We live in a time," he said, "when enemies don't wear uniforms. They don't march with banners. They slip through cracks. They exploit compassion. They weaponize our kindness. And when we leave our borders open, we are not being humane. We are being naive." Jasmine didn't move. Her hand still rested firmly on the red folder before her, the edges of its corners slightly bent from constant use. Her eyes remained forward, but those watching closely could see something shift, like the tightening of a violin string before it breaks. Pompeo continued, now pacing his words like a prosecuting attorney delivering a closing argument. "We are not just talking about people seeking opportunity. We're talking about drug cartels that flood our streets with fentanyl. We're talking about human traffickers who treat children like currency. We're talking about foreign adversaries who would love nothing more than to test our southern flank while Washington sleeps." The word children didn't go unnoticed. It landed heavily, intentionally, as if to preempt any emotional response from the other side of the table. But it rang hollow for anyone who knew the numbers. Jasmine knew them by heart. She knew how many American children had died not from cartel bullets, but from rationed insulin, from delayed ambulances, from clinics shuttered in budget committee backrooms. But Pompeo's voice never cracked. It didn't need to. "What we fund," he said, now glancing deliberately toward the senator seated behind him, "is not a wall. It is a message. It is a barrier between civilization and chaos. It tells the world that America still defends itself. The implication was clear. Those who opposed him were inviting collapse. They were architects of vulnerability. He let that settle in the air like smoke, wafting gently toward Jasmine Crockett, who still had not spoken a word. Not because she had nothing to say, but because Pompeo was still building his defense, brick by rhetorical brick. And those who object to this investment, he said, finally turning his gaze fully toward Jasmine, may have forgotten what this country stands to lose. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't sneer. He didn't have to. The calmness made it worse. The suggestion that she didn't understand the stakes, that her protest was rooted in ignorance rather than insight, wasn't just dismissive. It was surgical, designed to provoke without breaking decorum. It wasn't the first time Jasmine had been told she didn't understand national security. It wouldn't be the last. But in this moment, in front of the cameras, the microphones, and the polished patriarchy of the chamber, it was yet another reminder. She wasn't just confronting policy. She was confronting a worldview. And Pompeo's was built like a fortress. He sat back slightly, folding his hands. The portrait of a man convinced that facts didn't matter as much as the performance of conviction. Around him, the room remained still. No applause, no questions. Not yet. The silence after his words was the same kind you hear in courtrooms after a death sentence is read. Technical, clinical, irreversible. And still, Jasmine said nothing. Not yet, because storms never speak first. Pompeo's voice fell into silence like the final bolt on a locked steel door, firm, resolved, and not meant to be reopened. He leaned back, hands folded neatly in front of him, as if he'd just completed a classified briefing and was awaiting nothing more than a nod of approval. But across the table, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She let the silence stretch, not as surrender, but as strategy. And then, without a flicker of emotion on her face, she said quietly, I want to tell you about a boy named Darius Walker. No preamble, no credentials, no charts, just his name, and the room stilled again, this time for a different kind of impact. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her control was so complete, so surgical, it made the very air lean in to listen. He was 12, lived in Beaumont, Texas, bright kid, loved drawing robots, eating mango popsicles, and playing Fortnite on his mom's cracked iPad. He had type 1 diabetes, diagnosed at 6. The mundane details didn't soften the blow. They sharpened it. She didn't tell this story like a politician citing a case. She told it like someone who'd read the medical report, memorized the timestamps, felt the weight of the grief written between the lines. His mom, LaTanya, worked double shifts at a nursing home. His Medicaid covered his insulin, clinic visits, test strips, the bare minimum to keep him alive. Until it didn't. She paused. Her fingers tapped once, deliberately, on the red folder in front of her, as if activating something. On March 3rd, his Medicaid was terminated during the realignment. Not because she did anything wrong, not because he turned 18, not because of fraud, just reclassified. Administrative rollback, they called it. By March 10th, the pharmacy rejected his refill. The clinic told them they'd have to pay out of pocket. A hush moved through the chamber, like oxygen being drawn inward and not returned. She couldn't afford it, not even for a week's supply. So Darius did what 12-year-olds shouldn't have to do. He rationed. Her eyes flicked up, locking on Pompeo for the first time. He tried to be brave for his mother, said he wasn't dizzy, that the headaches were fine, that his vision wasn't blurry, until the morning of March 22nd, when he collapsed in the kitchen, having made it halfway through a peanut butter sandwich. The words didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. But every syllable sounded like a knuckle against bone. Paramedics arrived 7 minutes later. His blood sugar was unreadable. He went into cardiac arrest en route, died at the ER bay door, 32 feet from the entrance. She looked away just for a second, then back to Pompeo, who now sat noticeably stiller than before. And while LaTanya Walker was identifying her son's body at Baptist Hospital, your office, Mr. Pompeo, was finalizing a memorandum of support for Phase 2 funding of the U.S.-Mexico border wall, a memo that allocated $25 billion to steel, surveillance, and construction, citing urgent national interest. She opened the red folder and laid a copy of the memo on the table between them, carefully as if placing a headstone. Signed by you, dated March 20th. There was no accusation in her tone, only the deadly weight of precision. A line of sweat crawled along one senator's brow. The chamber, built for echo and power, suddenly felt too small for the quiet horror settling over it. Darius died 2 days later. I don't bring him up for pity. I bring him up for math, for values, for evidence. Now her voice dropped an octave, not softer but heavier. What does it say about a country that moves faster to pour concrete across a desert than to keep a child breathing in his own kitchen? Pompeo didn't answer. He didn't flinch, but something behind his eyes had begun to flicker. Doubt, maybe, or something more primal. Something human. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. If it had been your grandson, Mr. Pompeo, what would you have funded first? And then, just like that, she leaned back again. No flourish, no closure. Just a single devastating truth, offered like a mirror, daring him to look. The room hadn't moved since the name Darius Walker fell like a gavel onto the souls of everyone listening. But Jasmine wasn't done, not by grief, not by silence, and definitely not by the discomfort hanging in the lungs of men who had learned to look away when numbers became human. Her voice, once trembling with restraint, now turned surgical in its precision. Now let's look at what this country decided was worth the trade. She turned to the large monitor mounted behind her. With one tap to her screen, the congressional hearing room transformed, not into a place of debate, but a reckoning. The screen lit up. Black background, white lettering, stark, final. 1,800,000 Americans lost Medicaid coverage in the last fiscal year. She read it aloud, slowly, syllable by syllable, like a coroner delivering a cause of death. That's nearly 2 million people, not in another country, not over a decade. This year, this country, our people. Her finger hovered over the tablet, waiting only long enough for shame to begin festering in the corners of the room. Then, another tap. 32 rural health clinics closed. A U.S. map emerged on the screen, marked with deep red X's across Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, West Virginia. She didn't need to explain the image. It explained itself. These weren't buildings, they were lifelines. They delivered babies. They screened for cancer. They stabilized gunshot wounds. In some counties, they were the only healthcare provider for 100 miles. The red folder before her remained untouched now. The screen had become her scalpel. 32 clinics, and when they went dark, they didn't just turn off lights, they turned off hope. She tapped again. The next slide appeared with brutal simplicity. Insulin prices increased 400%. No line graph, no economist citations, just one photo, a pharmacy receipt for $1,014.78 stapled to a white prescription bag with the name redacted, except the age, 14. A single vial now costs more than some families earn in a week. Insulin, discovered over a century ago, costing less than $7 to manufacture, now bankrupts people just for the right to live. She didn't look at Pompeo yet, not because she was avoiding him, but because she was saving him for last. 400%, she repeated. That's not inflation. That's legislative neglect. That's financial triage inflicted on people too poor to vote their way out of it. Behind her, the screen faded to black again, and then came the final slide. One sentence burning across the darkness in oversized blood-red letters. Meanwhile, $25 billion was requested for expanded border wall construction. There was no animation, no sound cue, just a number so large it crushed the oxygen out of the room. Let that sink in, she said, her voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow louder than anything spoken yet. $25 billion, enough to cover insulin for every diabetic child in America for the next 50 years. Enough to reopen every shuttered clinic. Enough to give the uninsured a second chance instead of a final breath. She stood, not out of drama, but gravity. This was not a question of budget. It was a declaration of values. The words didn't echo. They landed and stayed. Heavy, unyielding, permanent. Jasmine stepped back into her seat, her gaze fixed on the frozen faces before her. And behind her, the screen remained unchanged. A number, a wound, a wall. The red text still burned across the screen behind her, but Jasmine didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth had already done its damage. The chamber was thick with a silence that felt almost holy until Mike Pompeo broke it. He exhaled through his nose. No tremble, no hesitation. Then he leaned forward slowly, like a man about to deliver a eulogy he didn't entirely believe in. "I grieve for that boy," he said, voice even, smooth, controlled. "I do." The words were perfectly modulated, but hollow at the center, like a flag folded with precision, but laid over the wrong coffin. He didn't look at Jasmine. He didn't look at the screen. He stared straight ahead as if speaking to the institution itself, not the people wounded by its choices. "No one wants a child to die," he continued, "but no nation can build its future on tragedy. We are not a government of sentiment. We are a government of laws." His jaw flexed slightly as he spoke. Behind the cool demeanor, there was steel, an unyielding belief that order mattered more than pain. That policy was always cleaner than people. We cannot afford to make national decisions through the lens of personal heartbreak. The role of this Congress is not to mourn, but to maintain, to protect. Now his eyes flicked to Jasmine, only briefly, like a tactical sweep, not a connection. Every dollar spent on securing our borders is not a theft from our compassion. It is the fulfillment of our duty. He sat a little straighter. His voice sharpened, turned colder. Border security is not the enemy of healthcare. It is the precondition for it, because every crisis that overwhelms our hospitals, every emergency room that collapses under pressure, begins with chaos at our southern flank. He let that statement breathe, like it was a fact carved in stone. "I've seen it. I've read the reports. Migrant crossings that end in ambulance rides. Emergency care consumed by patients who never paid into the system. Clinics forced to divert resources to people we never planned to serve." He paused again. Deliberate, exacting. "We are a generous nation, but generosity without control is suicide disguised as virtue." That line hung there, colder than anything he'd said before. "I understand the pain. I do. But pain cannot be our compass. Law must be." And finally, he delivered the sentence that struck like a blade wrapped in logic. A wall doesn't just stop illegal entry. It stops the ripple effect that empties our pharmacies, closes our clinics, and burdens our people. Every dollar for the wall is a down payment on the stability our healthcare system so desperately needs. He sat back, hands folded again, face unreadable. Not proud, not angry, just settled, like a man who believed he had restored order, wiped the table clean. But the table wasn't clean, because across from him sat a woman who had just buried a boy in front of the nation and was now watching the architect of that silence try to explain it away in the language of budget lines and national threat. And she hadn't blinked, not once. The stillness that followed Pompeo's final sentence wasn't silence, it was aftermath. His words lingered in the air like the cold smoke of a just-fired weapon. Law must be our compass. Every dollar for the wall is a down payment on stability. To the untrained ear, it sounded like strategy, but Jasmine Crockett had heard it before. Rhetoric polished enough to bury the consequences it creates. She didn't respond with rebuttal. She responded with evidence. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the red folder that had sat motionless in front of her throughout the hearing. An object so understated, it had almost faded into the furniture. But now, under the chamber's sterile lights, it became something else entirely. A vault. A loaded chamber of truths. Her fingers slid past several pages, skipping the stories and case studies. This wasn't the time for grief. This was the time for proof. She withdrew a single document and raised it, not high, not with drama, but with deadly intention. The page gleamed under the light, stamped with the unmistakable markings of federal origin, the seal of the Congressional Budget Office, the watermark of the Appropriations Subcommittee, and in the lower right-hand corner, a signature. "What I'm holding," she began, her voice cold and clear, "is a classified memorandum from the Congressional Budget Office. dated March 17th of last year. No tremble, no hesitation. Her tone had shifted into something almost surgical, too precise to be called emotion, too sharp to be dismissed as performance. It outlines a discretionary funding reallocation, $2.3 billion withdrawn from Medicaid stabilization reserves, redirected to the Department of Homeland Security for Phase 2 of the Border Infrastructure Expansion Project. She walked toward the exhibit display podium slowly, heels echoing like gunshots against marble. When she arrived, she placed the document down, turned it so the cameras could capture the signature, and tapped it twice with her index finger. It states clearly, funds moved pursuant to National Security Prioritization Guidelines issued in coordination with the U.S. Department of State. She turned back to the room, and for the first time during the hearing, she looked directly at Mike Pompeo. Not as an adversary, but as an author. That signature, she said, pointing again, is yours. Michael Richard Pompeo, Secretary of State. The room did not gasp. That would have been easier. Instead, it froze. A suspension of air, of posture, of certainty. The weight of the truth didn't break like glass. It settled like stone. Jasmine remained standing, her posture straight, her face unreadable. You sat here just moments ago and told this committee that our hospitals collapse under the burden of migrants, that the border wall is an investment in healthcare, that our problem is too much compassion. She let those words hang a moment. His words reflected back at him like a mirror held under floodlights. But this paper says otherwise. This isn't about migrants. This isn't about national threat. This is about arithmetic. It's about shifting billions from insulin to iron. Her voice lowered, not from weakness, but from gravity. You said I was guided by emotion, but this, she lifted the page slightly. This isn't emotion. It's policy. It's choice. It's quiet violence with a bureaucratic signature. She stepped back slowly, returning to her chair but remaining on her feet. So I'll ask you plainly, Mr. Pompeo, if this were just sentiment, if my case were made of feelings, why does your name appear at the bottom of a document that traded Medicaid for concrete? No one spoke. Not the chair, not the aides, not the rows of senators and staffers lined behind their microphones. Even the screen behind her, which moments ago had flashed with data and outrage, had gone black, as if to let the document speak on its own. There it sat, plain, dry, final, a government seal, a number, a name, and Jasmine Crockett's voice still lingering in the air, sharper than law, colder than logic. Do you still call this emotion? The paper with Pompeo's signature still sat on the evidence table, like a stone dropped in a still pond. Ripples of silence spreading outward from its weight. But Jasmine Crockett didn't sit down. She didn't relent. Her expression didn't change, but her body leaned slightly forward, and with it came a shift in the room's gravity. The evidence had spoken. Now came the reckoning. Her voice didn't rise. It tightened, a tone that wrapped around the air like wire. You signed this, she said slowly, each word landing like a verdict. You authorized the transfer. You redirected $2.3 billion away from health coverage and into steel. And just a few weeks later, 3 community health centers in Mississippi shut down. She didn't blink. The room didn't breathe. Not restructured, not relocated, not temporarily closed. Gone. She let that sink in, not as an accusation, but as a fact no man in that room could undo. Do you know what happens in places like Pike County, Mississippi, when the nearest emergency facility disappears? She didn't wait for an answer. Her hand returned to the red folder, no longer a symbol, but now an execution file. She pulled out a single sheet of paper, standard white, black border, a date in the top right corner. A name typed in clean, emotionless courier font. This is the death certificate of Elijah Walker, she said, the name cutting through the air like a blade. Age 9, cause of death, acute asthma attack. Time of death, 11:42 p.m. Her hand trembled now, but not from uncertainty, from the restraint it took to speak calmly while holding state-sanctioned failure in her fingers. Elijah lived in Forest County. When he had his attack, his mother drove to the clinic he used to go to for inhaler refills. She looked down at the certificate, then back at Pompeo. It was padlocked. A pause. The room leaned forward, quietly horrified. She called the next facility, 40 minutes away. They told her he no longer qualified under the new coverage rules, that they couldn't admit a non-insured minor without immediate payment. No outrage in her tone, just precision, clean, devastating. So she kept driving. She folded the certificate in half, not to hide it, but to control the tremor in her fingers. Elijah died in the back seat of a 2008 Toyota Corolla, his eyes wide, his lips blue, still clutching an empty inhaler in one hand and his mother's purse strap in the other. Now she looked at Pompeo fully, not as a colleague, not as a witness, but as a man responsible. Her voice dropped, not louder, but heavier, dragging every ear in the room toward her. If that had been your grandson, she stepped closer, slowly, deliberately, locking eyes with him. If that had been the child who runs to your chair after Sunday dinner, another step. If you had answered the phone at 11:43 and heard, "Daddy, Elijah's gone. He couldn't breathe." Her voice trembled, but it was not weakness. It was fury, leashed only by the solemnity of the setting. Would you still have signed that line? The room froze. No words, no shuffling. Even the air felt suspended, like the chamber itself couldn't absorb what had just been said. The death certificate lay folded on the table, Pompeo's name still visible on the budget memo beside it, and the silence in that room became a kind of confession no one dared interrupt. The silence after Jasmine's final words wasn't quiet. It was loaded, like a room bracing for the shattering sound of denial. And that sound came faster than anyone expected. Pompeo lurched forward, not the slow, deliberate lean of a man in control, but the explosive shift of someone pushed beyond the edges of his polished restraint. His voice cut through the chamber with a sharp, guttural rise that made even the staffers behind him flinch. "I will not be lectured," he snapped, his tone raw and rising. "I did what was necessary to protect this country." His hand struck the desk, not a slam, but a calculated blow, loud enough to dominate the space, loud enough to remind everyone that he wasn't here to be humbled. The sudden burst of volume reverberated through the room like an alarm. Members of Congress tensed in their seats. Jasmine remained frozen, unmoved, unblinking, like a fortress beneath fire. "Those numbers you parade," he continued, eyes burning, voice breaking the polished cadence he had maintained until now. "They're selected. They're framed to indict, not to inform. This isn't truth. It's theater." He was unraveling, not emotionally, but tactically. Every syllable was a blow aimed not at the argument, but at the credibility of the woman who dared challenge him in public. "You're standing on a stage of exceptions," he growled. "You want to take one death, one community, one heartbreak, and weaponize it like it explains the whole world. But that's not how governing works." His voice rose again, sharp enough to pierce, loud enough to intimidate. "You think America can be run on emotion? On stories? You think borders can be erased because of one death certificate? Then you don't understand what's at stake." That last sentence landed like a challenge, a blunt force dismissal dressed in the language of national duty. It wasn't just defiance, it was degradation. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. Her silence now stripped the volume from his outburst, exposing the desperation beneath every syllable. The chairman finally leaned forward, voice clipped and hard. "Mr. Pompeo, this committee will maintain order." The gavel slammed once, twice, wood on oak, sharp and jarring. But the damage had been done. The illusion of control, of statesmanship, of measured debate, it had collapsed. Across the chamber, the camera panned to the gallery. There they were, mothers, fathers, clinic workers, uninsured veterans, their faces stone still. Some leaned forward, some held hands. One woman quietly clutched a photograph. Another stared straight ahead, lips parted, like trying to breathe through something too thick to name. Because they'd heard that tone before, not just from a man at a podium, but from automated letters, hospital denials, voicemails that started with, "We're sorry to inform you." They knew what it meant to have their grief dismissed as strategy. They knew what it felt like when the system yelled louder to cover the fact it had already stopped listening. And now in the chamber of supposed justice, It was yelling again. The room hadn't recovered from the outburst. Pompeo's voice still echoed faintly in the air like smoke after a shot. But Jasmine Crockett stepped forward with the stillness of someone who didn't need volume to strike. Her calm wasn't weakness. It was control sharpened to the edge of a blade. She didn't raise her voice. She lowered it, just enough that everyone had to lean in, ears tightening, spines straightening. The tension wasn't rising, it was coiling. "Tell me something, Mr. Pompeo," she said. Her voice like cold steel dragged across velvet, slow and deliberate. "Did you ever sit down behind your locked doors in those classified rooms with all those charts and projections and calculate how many Americans would have to die from rationed insulin, from closed clinics, from untreated asthma?" She took a step closer, her eyes locked onto his, not as a gesture of aggression, but of unbearable clarity. "In order to build another 100 miles of steel wall in the desert?" No movement, no rebuttal. Her words didn't hit like accusations. They fell like eulogies. The silence that followed was not an absence of sound. It was a suspension of permission to speak. Something about the way she asked it, flat, unblinking, sincere, turned the question into something sacred, a moral weight that no man could lift with talking points. The gallery froze. Senators held their breath, caught between their instincts and the unbearable truth of the moment. Staffers stiffened, unsure whether to record or avert their eyes. Even the cameras, designed to move mechanically, seemed to pause just a fraction longer than usual. Pompeo's face, usually unreadable, carefully armored, twitched once near the jaw. A pulse, a hesitation. His mouth opened slightly, reflexively, like a man whose muscle memory had prepared a line, but his conscience hadn't shown up in time to deliver it. He didn't answer. He didn't shake his head. He didn't even blink. Instead, slowly, like a man realizing the weight of silence is sometimes heavier than the weight of words, he turned his head to the side, not in reflection, in retreat. He looked away. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't press. She didn't need to. The question had already landed, and its silence was louder than anything he could have said. The silence left by Pompeo's refusal to answer did not dissolve. It thickened. It clung to the walls, pressed against the marble columns, and hung in the stale Capitol air like a smoke that refused to clear. No one moved. No one dared speak. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She inhaled, once, slow, and turned to the chairman without looking at Pompeo again. "Mr. Chairman," she said, her voice low, "we'd like to call our next witness." The back doors of the hearing chamber creaked open, not grandly but with a sharp metal moan that made heads turn. A woman entered, young, slight, with weary eyes and a spine held rigid by the weight of things she'd never intended to carry. No press team, no prepared remarks, just the unmistakable aura of someone who'd lived through hell and wasn't sure this room deserved to hear about it. She wore navy scrubs under a gray cardigan, the sleeves rolled halfway up her forearms, revealing hands that shook not from fear, but from suppressed memory. A hospital badge clipped to her collar read Dr. Rena Wallace, Jefferson County Medical Center. In her left hand, she held a photo, 8 by 10, black and white, slightly bent. In her right, a sealed folder, thick with documents that had weight only because the man they referred to was now dead. She stepped to the microphone. No smile, no preamble, just breath and a single practiced nod. "My name is Rena Wallace. I'm an emergency physician in rural Mississippi. This," she raised the photo slightly, gently, like it was glass, "was my patient." The image caught in the camera lens and flooded across monitors. A young man, black, late 20s, shirtless beneath a hospital sheet, eyes closed, one hand visibly gripping the edge of a gurney. In the corner of the photo, a timestamp, 3:42 a.m. His face was peaceful, but not resting. It was absence. Dr. Wallace's voice stayed soft, but every word came out carved in stone. "He arrived with classic signs of appendicitis, sweating, pain in the lower right quadrant, fever at 103. We diagnosed him quickly. In any other hospital on any other day, we would have had him in surgery within an hour." She swallowed. Her eyes flicked to the panel. There was no accusation in her gaze. There didn't need to be. But Joshua had no insurance, and our hospital had just lost 5 ICU beds due to a federal budget decision made 8 weeks earlier. There was no place for him post-op. We called 4 hospitals. 3 said no. The 4th didn't answer. Her hand trembled just once. She gripped the podium tighter. I offered to monitor him myself in the recovery ward. I offered to transfer him in my own car if someone else could accept him. I begged for hours. Meanwhile, his pain worsened. He started vomiting. Then came the rupture. She didn't blink, but her next sentence came jagged. Joshua bled out from internal infection. I sedated him for the last 20 minutes so he wouldn't feel what his body was doing, and then I held his hand while it went cold. The silence returned, louder than before. Pompeo didn't look up. Aides stopped typing. Reporters forgot to press record. Dr. Wallace placed the photo down on the table, beside the exhibits already introduced. It made no sound, but its presence was deafening. That's what it means, she said, each syllable sharp, deliberate. To transfer funds from Medicaid to a border wall. That's what it means to label healthcare optional while pouring concrete through the desert. She reached into the folder and withdrew a single sheet. The death summary. Time of death, 4:11 a.m. Cause, septic shock. Perforated appendix. No surgical intervention. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She simply whispered, "He could have been saved." But there was no room. And this time, even the air itself seemed ashamed to move. The doctor's testimony didn't end with a mic drop or applause. It ended with absence. The kind that fills a room not with noise but with consequence. The kind of silence that can't be escaped by shifting in a chair or shuffling papers. Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't need to. Neither did the room. For 10 full seconds, time itself seemed suspended between breath and reckoning. Then came a sound, not loud, not forceful, but barely audible over the courtroom air. A man once called the architect of America First now sat still, his shoulders taut as wire beneath his navy suit. And with the dryness of someone who had lost grip of the moment and was searching blindly for moral high ground, Mike Pompeo spoke. "I didn't choose who dies," he said, voice gravel thin. "I chose a nation that survives." The words were meant to sound resolute, but they fell into the chamber like cold ash. Not righteous, not brave, merely tired. The voice of a man who once knew how to command silence, but now surrounded by data, death, and a child's unclaimed future, had nothing left but doctrine. Across the table, Jasmine didn't even flinch. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply watched, with a stillness far more devastating than any retort. Because in that stillness, every listener could feel the weight she carried, the stories not read into the record, the faces behind those numbers. Around them, the air grew tighter. Senator Walford, who just 20 minutes earlier had nodded in agreement as Pompeo warned of border surges, now stared down at the cost chart. His brow twitched. A vein in his temple pulsed as if his body itself were rejecting what his politics once embraced. To his left, Senator Rowe, long known for his zero-tolerance speeches, quietly pushed the document on Elijah Walker, the dead 9-year-old, further under his papers. He wasn't reading it. He couldn't. And suddenly, the line between loyalty and shame began to blur. Behind them in the gallery, no one coughed. No one whispered. Even the cameras didn't dare zoom. There was nothing performative about this pause. It was the silence of realization. The kind that doesn't happen when an argument is won, but when a truth finally lands too deep to be ignored. Pompeo glanced down, as if the table in front of him might offer something to hold on to. But there was no press release waiting, no Fox News rebuttal, only the echo of his own voice, now absorbed by a room that had outgrown it. And still, no one moved. Because what could be said to undo the image of a dying man in a shuttered ICU? What sound could be made to unsign a line that had traded human breath for steel fencing? And how does one defend a policy when even its architects have begun to look away? In that moment, the former Secretary of State looked less like a guardian of national security and more like a man left alone with the consequences he never thought would catch up to him. And Jasmine never said a word. Not yet, because the silence was already doing the speaking for her. And just when it seemed no words could deepen the weight already hanging in the room, Jasmine moved, not with fury, not with defiance, but with a quiet precision that carried the gravity of a funeral procession. She reached beneath her folder, pulled out a small object wrapped in sterile gauze, and unwrapped it slowly in full view of the chamber. A single empty insulin vial. The glass clicked gently as she set it down on the polished wood, the sound soft but unmistakable, like the ticking of a countdown only she could hear. "This," she said, her voice low and flat, "could have saved a child." The sentence didn't echo. It landed like a flat line on a heart monitor, unmistakable in finality. She didn't look at Pompeo yet. She spoke to the room, to the camera, to the millions of Americans watching on screens far from Capitol Hill, many of whom knew exactly what it meant to pray over a prescription they couldn't afford. "While you drafted signatures and shifted decimal points from health to steel," she continued, "this little vial, worth $37 on paper, $400 without insurance, was the difference between a family and a funeral." She let the silence settle again, not by force, but because it had to. It was the only thing big enough to hold the truth she'd just dropped. Then she finally turned to Pompeo. "Your steel wall didn't resuscitate anyone, Mr. Secretary," she said, "but this could have saved hundreds of thousands." Her fingers lingered on the vial, not for effect, but because she couldn't look away from it either. Even she had to ground herself in something real, in something small enough to hold, but powerful enough to break a nation in half. The cameras, as if guided by instinct, zoomed in, first on her hand, then on the vial, then finally on Mike Pompeo's face, and he didn't move, didn't blink, didn't twitch. He stared at the vial as if it were radioactive, something too dangerous to touch, too human to dismiss. Behind him, the weight of contradiction bore down like an avalanche. $25 billion in reinforced metal designed to keep people out, while millions inside died waiting for basic medicine. A wall that promised protection, while the interior of the country hemorrhaged from neglect. The metaphor wasn't just powerful, it was surgical. This wasn't policy debate. This was indictment without a jury. Even the congressional stenographer had slowed her typing. The tension was that thick, that absolute. No one dared cough. No one even reached for their coffee. The vial had done what arguments could not. It had made life and death tangible, measurable not in theory, but in milliliters. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Do you know what this vial means in East Texas?" she asked. "It means a mother skipping her own doses so her son can survive the school week." She paused. "Do you know what it means in the Bronx? It means a diabetic man cutting his insulin in half and praying his foot doesn't go numb before payday." She looked at Pompeo again, this time not with fury but with something colder, conviction. "But you wouldn't know that," she said, "because no one dies behind a podium. They die in silence, in kitchens, in parking lots, in the back of Ubers that don't make it to the ER in time." She tapped the vial gently, a tiny clink, the only sound in the room. "And they die," she whispered, "because someone, somewhere, thought border steel was more American than their breath." Pompeo opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Not even a deflection. His lips parted as if to say something, but all he managed was a shallow breath and a stiff swallow, as though the words he usually commanded were now stuck somewhere between his heart and his conscience. Jasmine stood perfectly still. No need for papers now, no charts, no bar graphs. Just that small vial, sitting like a memorial between them. The chairman looked stunned, as if uncertain whether to call for a recess or a reckoning. Even the aides, those always glancing, note-passing, whisper-leaning aides, had gone still. Somewhere in the gallery, a woman wiped her cheek. No one applauded. It wasn't that kind of moment, because what Jasmine had done wasn't performance. It was an autopsy on American priorities, and the body on the table wasn't just Elijah, or the 28-year-old appendicitis victim, or the millions who rationed insulin with a calendar and prayer. The body was the soul of a nation that had forgotten its pulse, and on that table, next to budget proposals and legal memos, sat the quietest, deadliest thing of all. An empty vial, a question, and a silence so deep even the cameras dared not breathe. And for a long moment, the room was completely still, so still that even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder than breath. Jasmine hadn't moved. The vial sat between her and Pompeo like a verdict, and the silence didn't crack. It collapsed, not with a bang, but with the sound of one pair of hands, slowly and deliberately clapping. It came from the public gallery, row 3, left side, where a silver-haired man in a navy suit had been stone-faced through most of the hearing. His name was Frederick Holt, a retired defense contractor and longtime critic of Crockett's stance on budget reallocation. He had once publicly accused her of weaponizing sentimentality, but now his hands moved in solemn rhythm, his face pale, his jaw clenched, his eyes never leaving the vial on the table. Each clap echoed like gunfire against the marble walls. And then another person rose beside him, a woman in a denim jacket, hand trembling but face set in defiant awe. Then a third, and a fourth. Within seconds, the gallery transformed. People weren't just clapping, they were standing, some with mouths open in disbelief, others with tears in their eyes. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in something deeper. Recognition, grief, a breaking point. The chairman's gavel struck once, then twice. "Order, please. The gallery must remain." But even he couldn't finish the sentence, because the flood had begun. Cameras swung back to the audience. A mother raised a photo of her son who died of type 1 complications. A nurse in uniform shouted, "She's not wrong." Staffers at the edge of the chamber backed up as if bracing for a wave. The hearing room, long a cathedral of procedure and decorum, was now a confessional for every family that had suffered in silence, while policymakers traded lives for contracts. A younger man in the back, face streaked with emotion, shouted hoarsely, "Tell me what a wall's worth if my wife's not alive to see it." The sound ricocheted like a thrown stone. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She simply stepped back, letting the moment breathe, letting truth do what rhetoric never could. And Pompeo, still seated, still silent, gripped the edge of the table with both hands, knuckles white. He looked not at the crowd but down at the vial, and for the first time that morning he seemed small, like a man forced to sit in the ruins of the fortress he'd helped build, brick by brick, bill by bill. "Madam Congresswoman," the chairman said, his voice cracking despite himself, "we must regain order." Jasmine turned slowly, her voice calm, almost eerily so. "Order will return, but not before truth is heard." She turned back to the crowd, her gaze sweeping across the faces. Faces of those who had come to judge her, dismiss her, silence her. And now they were with her, not because she had changed the facts, but because the facts had finally become undeniable. She gestured softly to the vial, still centered like a monument on the table. "This is what order forgot." In the gallery, a young woman crumpled into her seat, weeping into her palms. Another pressed a hand against the glass of the observation booth like she could reach through it. And outside the chamber, the ripple began to spread. The press room buzzed with reporters scrambling for footage. C-SPAN's live comments exploded with real-time reactions. Anchors scrambled for language strong enough to match the moment. A moment not manufactured or staged, but earned through anguish. Behind the scenes, committee aides whispered urgently into phones. At least 3 senators stepped away from their monitors, visibly shaken. And for the first time all week, the network producers didn't cut to commercial. They let it run. Raw, unedited, unresolved. A country was watching, and feeling, and remembering. Meanwhile, inside the chamber, something extraordinary unfolded. The man who had clapped first, Frederick Holt, stepped forward to the railing. His voice, once filled with skepticism, now carried like thunder. "She's right," he said. "We forgot what we were supposed to protect." The chairman struck the gavel again, but this time not as a rebuke. It sounded more like punctuation, like the closing of a chapter. The camera caught Jasmine's eyes just for a second, and in them was something fiercer than rage. Proof. Proof that data could become grief, that grief could become courage, and that courage, when weaponized with truth, could dismantle a fortress made of policy and pride. And then, a moment almost too surreal to believe. From the right side of the gallery, a man in a red tie and a Veterans for Border Security lapel pin stood up slowly, pulled a folded paper from his inside jacket pocket, and held it in the air. "This," he called, "is my son's denial letter from Medicaid." He looked down at it, voice breaking. "We buried him 3 months ago." His hand trembled, and then he dropped the paper over the railing. It drifted down like a white leaf, falling not onto the desk, but next to the insulin vial, a document of death beside a tool of survival. Two artifacts of a war waged not with bullets, but with budgets. Jasmine didn't reach for it. She let it lie there. The weight of it spoke louder than any reply. And Pompeo, who had once spoken with the gravity of a nation behind him, sat with nothing left to say, his brow furrowed, his gaze locked on the fallen paper, his myth of righteous spending unraveling with every second the room refused to return to silence. At the edge of the room, a child's voice, quiet but clear, broke through. "Mama, why are they crying?" And a woman answered without shame, "Because somebody finally told the truth." That truth now hovered in the air, heavier than any wall, more piercing than any accusation. It wasn't just that Jasmine had won the argument. It was that she had altered it, reframed it, redefined the terms. No longer was it about national security versus healthcare. It was about whose lives counted in the first place. And in that chamber, bathed in light, echoing with heartbeats and held breath, that question no longer had a comfortable answer. Jasmine looked to the chairman. She said nothing. She didn't need to, because she had already said everything that mattered. And the room, once hostile, now hushed, sat inside the blast radius of that truth. No one moved to rebuild the wall Pompeo had erected with his words. Not even him. And that was the moment the hearing changed, not because of a vote or a ruling or a headline, but because the people stood, and finally Congress listened. The chamber still trembled with the aftershock of human grief turned political reckoning. The insulin vial remained on the desk, flanked by the fallen denial letter. The air was electric, not with rage or protest, but with something far more dangerous to those in power: awakened conscience. The room hadn't returned to order. It had ascended into truth, and Jasmine Crockett stood at the epicenter of it, motionless, shoulders squared, eyes lifted. The camera panned in slowly, almost reverently, closing the distance between viewer and witness. The lens framed her face, no longer just a congresswoman, but a woman carrying the weight of 1.8 million people stripped of coverage. 32 clinics shuttered, and one child named Elijah, who had died with his tiny lungs empty. No political slogan could reach this moment. No rebuttal could override it. Jasmine turned not to the chairman, not to Pompeo, but to the camera, as if speaking not to Washington, but to the country itself. Her voice didn't rise. It cut. "A nation is not built on brick." The words dropped like stones into still water, sending ripples no one dared disturb. Behind her, the staffers froze. The audience leaned in, as if the truth might slip through the air and vanish if they blinked. "It is built on dignity." She paused. One heartbeat. Two. And that dignity is being stripped, page by page, clinic by clinic, child by child. Every syllable sharpened itself against the silence. Her tone didn't ask for sympathy. It demanded remembrance. She wasn't pleading anymore. She was documenting, marking this moment for history, as though she knew one day students would replay this clip and study not the policy, but the pain behind it. The camera zoomed tighter. You could see the moisture in her eyes, but it didn't spill. She was not weeping. She was burning, from the inside out, with the fire only the betrayed can carry. And across the country, where millions watched live from hospital waiting rooms, nursing homes, school cafeterias, and kitchen counters, they didn't see a Democrat or a witness. They saw a mirror. A single father in Ohio stood in front of his TV, one hand over his chest. A retired nurse in Oklahoma whispered to no one, "Yes, finally." And in a Fox affiliate control room in Florida, a producer quietly ordered the next commercial break be skipped. Because this was the story. At the head of the room, the chairman's hand hovered near the gavel, but something in him hesitated. The rules said to end it now. The law said to close the record. But the moment, it begged for just 1 second longer. Jasmine's eyes scanned the chamber one last time. Pompeo sat still, now flanked by papers he didn't touch and documents he couldn't defend. His jaw locked, his face tight. And yet, he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. No wall, no steel, no speech could be taller or stronger than that empty vial of insulin. We talk of survival as if it's a border, but dignity is what makes survival worth anything at all. The lights above flickered just slightly, as if the old bones of the chamber felt the weight of what had been said. She stepped back slowly. The chairman, voice now barely above a whisper, lifted the gavel. "This hearing is concluded." The gavel fell. Crack, but no one moved. Not a soul. Because that sound, usually the signal for dismissal, felt this time like a full stop at the end of a chapter this nation could never again pretend wasn't written. The kind of silence that follows a confession, or a eulogy, or the final breath of something too long buried. The camera pulled wide. The room remained full. People didn't leave. People didn't even blink. Like history had cracked open a little seam in its spine, and everyone knew. They were inside it. The chairman sat down slowly, hands folded, eyes distant. He didn't bother to adjourn twice. Even he knew the room had changed. Jasmine gathered her notes, not urgently, not triumphantly, but with the reverence of someone folding a flag after a funeral. And yet, there was no applause, no chants. Just breathe. Just the soft shuffling of stunned humanity, unable to stand yet unwilling to forget. Even the walls seemed to remember. Even the air felt different. A Capitol staffer at the rear of the room, no older than 23, whispered into her phone, "She just buried the wall with a plastic vial." The hearing chamber doors stayed open, but the people didn't exit. They lingered, not to protest, not to celebrate, but to witness. And far beyond D.C., something strange happened in America. In grocery store checkout lines, strangers spoke to each other. Did you see it? In nursing homes, volunteers turned the TV volume up. On factory floors, production lines paused as workers gathered around communal screens. Because for once, truth had made it past the filter. And it was unbearable. And it was unforgettable. And it had a name. Dignity. And though the hearing was over, the story was not. But for now, within these historic walls, beneath portraits of men long dead and ideals long compromised, the people did not leave. They sat. They stared. They remembered. Because a woman in red had looked into the eye of a machine and whispered something braver than law. "You built a wall. I held a life." And the echo of that sentence wouldn't fade. Not today. Not in this room. Not across the nation. Not in the memory of a boy named Elijah or a man who died in a doctor's arms. Not in the pulse of a moment when America, if only for a breath, remembered its soul. No further questions. No rebuttals. Only the sharp, unmovable stillness of a country that could no longer pretend its conscience hadn't heard. And in that stillness, history changed direction. And as the silence stretched long after the final gavel drop, something far deeper than policy began to surface. Something not written in any bill, not spoken in any testimony. It wasn't just about budgets or Medicaid or steel. It was about what kind of nation could still look itself in the mirror after watching a child die for lack of insulin while spending billions to stack bricks in the desert. The weight of that truth didn't fade with the closing remarks. It multiplied, echoing in every breathless second that followed. Because in that moment, the room had ceased to be a hearing. It had become a reckoning. And when Jasmine finally stepped down, the lesson she had just taught didn't hang like a lecture. It clung like a wound. She hadn't come to argue policy. She had come to resuscitate compassion, and she had done so not with fury or slogans, but with stories, with names, with death certificates and insulin vials, with the unbearable question no politician ever wants to face. What if it had been your child? The lesson then wasn't hidden. It was screaming. A nation that forgets the faces behind the figures is a nation that bleeds without knowing why. A country that defends walls more fiercely than its own wounded has lost the thread of its purpose. What Jasmine offered wasn't just critique, it was a mirror. And in it, America saw what it had become: armored, angry, and dangerously indifferent to the lives it was built to protect. The injustice wasn't abstract. It had names, dates, and last breaths. And that was the point. Jasmine never said, "Look at me." She said, "Look at them. Look at Elijah. Look at the 28-year-old with a burst appendix. Look at the ICU beds collecting dust because someone in a marble office decided a fence was worth more than a family." The camera didn't pan to party affiliations. It panned to expressions, to the way even seasoned politicians suddenly couldn't meet her eyes, to the way the American public held its breath like it was the one hooked up to a ventilator. And if there's one enduring lesson from this fire-forged confrontation, it's this: empathy is not weakness. It is the very root of leadership. Pompeo had numbers. He had clearance levels and national security justifications. He had iron and concrete. But Jasmine had one thing more powerful than any of that: the courage to feel, to let grief speak in a room built for cold debate, to let loss pierce the armor of bureaucracy. That's what turned a hearing into a historical moment. Not just what was said, but what was felt. Because this wasn't about one boy, it was about millions of Americans who have been told, quietly, cruelly, that they are too poor to matter, that their pain is the cost of order, that if they die, it is a regrettable but necessary part of the plan. Jasmine's lesson was that such logic is not stability. It is moral collapse disguised as pragmatism. She dared the room and the nation to do something radical, to care. To care not because a headline said to, not because a party demanded it, but because at the core of our American identity, we are nothing if not a people who believe every life counts, or we are liars when we pledge liberty and justice for all. And so the lesson endures, that dignity is not abstract, that patriotism without compassion is performance, that budgets are moral documents, that any law that does not protect the vulnerable is not a law, it is a weapon. Jasmine didn't change the law that day, but she changed the terms of the debate. She forced the room to redefine what security means. Is it barbed wire at a border? Or is it a mother being able to buy insulin without choosing between medicine and groceries? Is it drones in the sky? Or is it making sure no child ever gasped their last breath because bureaucracy denied them care? She didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. And now the burden was no longer on her to prove why Medicaid matters. The burden was on every lawmaker to explain why, in God's name, it was ever up for debate. This was the human lesson: that silence in the face of suffering is complicity. That steel is strong, but not as strong as a voice unwilling to look away. That even in the coldest rooms, lit by fluorescence and drowned in paperwork, a single act of moral clarity can shift the tectonic plates of power. And so, the story would not end with the gavel. It would echo in policy briefings, in editorials, in classrooms, in late-night kitchen table arguments. It would echo in campaign ads, yes, but more importantly in the quiet decisions of citizens who had seen the price of indifference. Because Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge Mike Pompeo, she challenged America's conscience. And for one unforgettable moment, it answered. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.